June 24th, 1314. If you were to stand on the banks of the Bannockburn on this specific morning, you would witness a sight that defies human comprehension. The stream, a tributary of the River Forth, is no longer flowing with water. Instead, it has been paved solid with the flower of the English aristocracy. The ravine is so choked with the crushed bodies of armored knights and the carcasses of drowned warhorses that a man can walk from one bank to the other without his boots ever touching the water. You are not stepping on mud or stone. You are stepping on the faces of earls, barons, and the finest heavy cavalry Europe has ever produced. This grisly bridge of the dead is the result of a catastrophe that history books often sanitize with words like bravery and spirit. But make no mistake, this is not a battle in the traditional sense. It is a traffic jam of death. It is a catastrophic failure of logistics where thousands of men have been herded into a geographical killbox and slaughtered by a force a fraction of their size. History tells us the Scots won the Battle of Bannockburn through sheer heart and patriotic fervor. That is a comforting lie we tell ourselves to romanticize warfare. The truth is far colder and much more interesting. The Scots won because they turned the landscape itself into a weapon of mass destruction. To understand how we arrived at this river of corpses, we must strip away the romantic myths of the Middle Ages. When we think of medieval combat, Hollywood has trained us to imagine chaotic, honorable duels where the good guys win because they have the moral high ground. But war in the 14th century was not about morality. It was about mathematics, physics, and terror. By all calculated metrics, what happened here should have been impossible. The English army that marched north that summer was not just a military force. It was a moving city, the Death Star of the medieval world. Led by King Edward II, this juggernaut consisted of over perhaps 3,000 heavy cavalry, the medieval equivalent of modern battle tanks, and somewhere between 16,000 and 20,000 infantry and archers. These were professional killers encased in plate and mail, riding destriers bred specifically to trample human beings into paste. The supply train alone was said to be 20 miles long, laden with gold, wine, and portable wardrobes, because King Edward was so certain of victory that he packed for a coronation celebration, not a fight. Opposing this Leviathan was Robert the Bruce, the self-proclaimed King of Scots. His force was laughable in comparison. He commanded perhaps 6,000 men, mostly spearmen, with a handful of light cavalry. They had no heavy armor, no endless supply wagons, and they were exhausted from years of brutal guerrilla warfare. If you were a betting man in 1314, putting money on the Scots wasn't a gamble. It was an act of charity. The English outnumbered them 3-1, potentially 4-1. However, numbers on a ledger do not account for the terrain, and they certainly do not account for the terrifying clarity of desperation. Robert the Bruce knew he could not defeat the English in an open field. To do so would be immediate suicide. So he decided he wouldn't fight on a field at all. He decided to change the map. The strategic prize at the center of this collision was Stirling Castle. It is impossible to overstate the importance of this fortress. It was the brooch that clasped the Highlands and Lowlands together. Whoever held Stirling held the throat of Scotland, and Edward II was coming to squeeze it shut. This entire bloodbath was triggered by a bizarre bureaucratic technicality. A year prior, Robert's brother, Edward Bruce, had made a gentleman's agreement with the English commander of the castle. The deal was simple. If the English army didn't arrive to relieve the castle by Midsummer's Day, 1314, the castle would surrender to the Scots without a fight. It was meant to be a clever diplomatic squeeze, but it backfired spectacularly. It gave the King of England a deadline. It gave him a specific date and a specific location where he had to show up. For a guerrilla fighter like Robert the Bruce, this was a tactical nightmare. His entire strategy relied on hitting, running, and vanishing into the mist. He survived by being a ghost. Now, his brother's foolish deal forced him to become a wall. He had to stand and fight a pitched battle against the mightiest army in Christendom on a day chosen by the enemy. When Bruce heard about the deal, he was reportedly furious, likely wanting to strangle his brother. He knew that facing English heavy cavalry on open ground was a death sentence. A charge of 2,000 heavy horses generated enough kinetic energy to shatter any infantry formation instantly. The ground would shake, the noise would be deafening, and the psychological impact alone caused most armies to break and run before contact was even made. So, Bruce had to make a choice. He could retreat, letting Stirling Castle remain in English hands and losing his credibility as king, or he could stand and risk the total annihilation of Scotland's fighting power. He chose to stand, but he wasn't going to play by English rules. If the English were bringing a hammer, Bruce wasn't going to be the nail. He was going to be the anvil. He arrived at the battlefield weeks early to prepare. He walked the ground of the new park, a hunting reserve south of the castle. He looked at the marshy streams of the Bannockburn. He looked at the dense trees, and he began to visualize a kill box. This is where the story shifts from a tale of bravery to a masterclass in combat engineering. Bruce realized that the English army's greatest strength, its massive size and heavy cavalry, was also its greatest weakness. They were slow, they needed vast amounts of space to maneuver, and they were arrogant. Bruce decided to use that arrogance against them. He began to prepare the ground, transforming the landscape itself into a trap. This wasn't just about digging a few ditches. It was an industrial-scale excavation project designed to funnel the English into a meat grinder. As the sun rose on the days leading up to the battle, the Scots weren't just sharpening spears. They were laborers. They dug hundreds of small, knee-deep pits known as pots. These weren't large moats. They were precise, honeycomb traps, each about a foot wide and hidden with sticks and grass. Inside each pit, they placed a sharp wooden stake pointing upward. The design was cruel and specific. It wasn't meant to kill a man. It was meant to snap the leg of a horse. Bruce knew that a charging knight on a horse is a tank, but a knight on the ground, trapped under a screaming, thrashing animal, is just a man in a metal-can waiting to be opened. On the afternoon of June 23rd, the main English army was still struggling through the narrow roads to the south, but the vanguard arrived. These were the eager young knights, the glory hunters. They rode out expecting to flush out a few terrified peasant skirmishers. Instead, they found the Scottish army waiting in disciplined circles. And right there, riding out in front of his lines, was the king himself. Robert the Bruce was not hiding. He was wearing a gold circlet around his helmet, a gleaming target that said, "I am the king." But there was a problem. Bruce wasn't on a massive warhorse. He was riding a small, nimble palfrey, essentially a pony meant for travel, not combat. To an English knight, this looked like a joke. It looked like a gift from God. Enter Sir Henry de Bohun. He was the nephew of the Earl of Hereford, young, heavily armored, and riding a destrier that weighed as much as a small car. He spotted the gold crown. He saw the small horse. In his mind, the war was already over. He believed he was about to end the Scottish rebellion with a single lance thrust and become the greatest hero in English history. He lowered his lance, spurred his monster of a horse, and charged. By all military logic, Robert the Bruce should have retreated behind his wall of spears. A man on a pony does not joust with a heavy cavalryman. It is physics. If de Bohun's lance connected, the kinetic energy would punch through Bruce's armor and lift him out of the saddle like a rag doll. His generals were screaming internally for him to run. But Bruce didn't move. He sat motionless on his small horse, watching the English knight thunder toward him. The ground shook. The distance closed. 80 yards. 40 yards. 10. At the very last second, just as the steel tip of the lance was about to pierce his chest, Bruce pulled his rein. He didn't panic, he pivoted. His small, agile horse sidestepped the charging destrier with the grace of a matador dodging a bull. De Bohun missed. His momentum carried him past the king, exposing his flank and the back of his head. In that split second, Bruce stood up in his stirrups. He was wielding a battle axe. He didn't swing it wildly. He brought it down with the precision of a woodcutter splitting a log. The axe struck de Bohun's helmet. The force was so immense that it didn't just dent the steel. It clove through the helmet and split the knight's skull from crown to chin. The handle of the axe shattered from the impact. Henry de Bohun was dead before he hit the ground. The silence that followed must have been deafening, broken only by the thud of the body and the cheers erupting from the Scottish lines. This wasn't just a duel. It was a psychological nuclear bomb. The English vanguard froze. They had just watched their champion, fully armored and mounted on a tank, get deleted by a man on a pony with a hand axe. The invincibility of the English knight was shattered in an instant. Bruce returned to his lines, calm and composed. When his commanders scolded him for his recklessness, his response was legendary in its nonchalance. He looked at the splintered wood in his hand, shrugged, and simply said, "I have broken my good axe." That night, the English army camped in the Carse of Balquhidder, a tidal marsh. It was a logistical hell. Packed shoulder to shoulder in the mud, unable to lie down, morale plummeted. Meanwhile, a traitor, Sir Alexander Seton, crossed lines to tell Bruce the English were disorganized. Bruce decided to do the unthinkable. He would attack at dawn. He would use the Schiltron, a mobile forest of spears, to compress the English against the river. Dawn broke on June 24th. The English watched in disbelief as the Scots marched out and knelt in prayer. "They ask for mercy," King Edward laughed. "They do," replied a wiser adviser, "but not from you. They ask it of God, for these men will conquer or die." The battle that followed was a massacre of compression. The Scottish Schiltrons advanced, turning the English army into a pressurized crush. The English cavalry charged but shattered against the pikes. The infantry behind them pushed forward, trapping their own men. Knights were lifted off their feet by the crush, suffocating while standing upright. The English archers, the one force that could have saved them, were flanked and destroyed by Scottish light cavalry. With no room to maneuver, the English army dissolved into panic. Then came the final blow. On the ridge above, the small folk, camp followers, cooks, and women appeared, waving blankets as flags and banging pots. To the terrified English, it looked like a fresh army. Panic turned into a rout. The English fled into the Bannockburn, drowning in their armor, creating the bridge of corpses. King Edward fled, humiliated. Sir Giles d'Argenton, the third best knight in Europe, refused to flee, charging back into the Scottish lines to die rather than live in shame. The victory was absolute. The Scots captured enough wealth from the baggage train to transform their nation's economy overnight. But the legacy of Bannockburn wasn't gold, it was an idea. 6 years later, the Declaration of Arbroath would state that a king rules only by the consent of his people, a radical concept that would eventually echo in the American Declaration of Independence. The lesson of Bannockburn is not about passion, it is about intellect. Robert the Bruce didn't defeat Edward II because he shouted louder. He defeated him because he understood the environment. He used the pots to neutralize horsepower. He used the Schiltrons to neutralize mass. He used the small folk to weaponize fear. It was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Sometimes you don't need a bigger army. You just need to hold your ground, sharpen your spear, and wait for the giant to step into the trap. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the brutal engineering of medieval warfare, please help us win our own battle against the algorithm by hitting that like button and subscribing. It really does make a difference. Until next time, keep questioning the official narrative.